Okay, thanks for joining the podcast today. Today's podcast is about speed limits, and there's been a lot of discussion in Nebraska lately about speed limits. It seems to be a lot of discussion locally in pockets across the state, but really statewide there's been a lot of discussion this year because of the legislation to increase some of our speed limits in the state. I've had a lot of conversation about speed limits because of that legislation. And one of the things that's very clear to me is that the way in which we set speed limits is not very intuitive. It's technical, and a lot of the things that people assume about how we set speed limits are not true, and in fact, sometimes the opposite is true. And it's also been clear through my conversation with the folks here at the department is that raising speed limits and how we set speed limits is not something that the people and the engineers in the department take very lightly at all. It's a very serious thing. A lot of technical research goes into these conversations, and I have a lot of respect for that process and for the people that are leading it. One thing that I was very impressed with throughout this conversation this year is the debate in the unicameral. When the speed limit bill came up on the floor, it was very clear that the senators have a lot of respect for the Department of Transportation and for the engineers that work here. It was a very good and robust debate, but one thing that people kept coming back to is that if the department tells us this is what we need to do, then we need to support and trust them, and that was very encouraging to see. I know that trust is there because of a long history of credibility here at the department. So I know there's lots and lots of folks that have helped us get to that point, and it was on clear display that day. When it comes to who those folks are, I'm pleased that today we have a couple of them on the podcast. In Dan Waddle, the state traffic engineer, and Alan Swanson, a traffic engineer that works with Dan and focuses a lot on setting speed limits and studying how to set speed limits on our state system. There's a lot of interesting things to learn about speed limits and about the work that Dan and Alan do for us every day, and so I'm very pleased to have them on the podcast. And let's go ahead and just get to that conversation. Thanks for joining the podcast today. I got a couple of guests. I'm very excited about this one. So we've got Dan Waddle from Traffic Engineering. So Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've worked here about 35 years.
And you're what's your title?
I'm a traffic engineer.
State traffic engineer. That's a big deal. Is it not?
It is.
It is, yeah, I think so.
My career with Department of Transportation has all been in traffic engineering in various different job duties within the division.
So you've been in traffic engineering the whole time?
Yes.
And now you lead the group. Good. And you've brought with you?
Alan Swanson, a traffic analysis engineer.
Alan, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So what's your background?
So I've been with the state for about 17 years now, mostly with traffic engineering, but started off as an intern here in the traffic engineering division. After college, after I graduated, went out to the field for about a year, and then realized, I was more of an office guy, and luckily there was a position open in traffic engineering, so I took that job and worked there for another 5 or 6 years, and then took a different path and worked down with the planning division for a little bit. Luckily there was an opening for the section leader of the analysis section, so I've been there.
You've been back to traffic engineering.
Yep.
So Dan, there are some places in the department where folks tend to sort of want to be a part of. It's sort of in their heart. I think of Bridge that way. There's a lot of folks who've been in Bridge and they like bridges, and that's where they go. Is traffic engineering the same way? It sounds like you've been there the whole time. Alan, you tried to leave but kept coming back. Is that sort of the story in traffic?
It is. I think a lot of us stick around in traffic for a while. It was kind of my interest in college, traffic engineering. We had a professor that was very traffic engineering oriented, trained a lot of us traffic engineers.
That's where your heart is. Yeah.
It is.
Good. Well, thanks for joining me today. So we're going to talk about speed limits today. Before I get specifically into speed limits, I want to ask you guys, because I spend a lot of time with the different engineering groups here at the department, and it seems like the one thing that's different about traffic is that some of the analysis that you do, some of the recommendations that you do, aren't always intuitive to people. And I think partly because everyone drives, so everyone thinks they're an expert in traffic engineering, whether it's signals or roundabouts or speed limits. We don't face that same challenge with our bridge engineers or our pavement engineers or our road design engineers. But for you guys, it's like you're constantly having to explain yourself and justify your recommendations. Is that true, Dan? I mean, that's my observation.
Yeah, I would say that's very true. You're going against opinions, public opinions, or there may be crashes or something happening at a location that engineering-wise, traffic engineering, there's not the solution that maybe they want, or what they want is not necessarily going to reduce the crashes or the concerns that they might have.
And intuitively, they might think, for example, if we put a traffic signal in here, it would be safer for everybody. But the engineering might say, actually, putting a traffic signal in here could make it worse. And that's what the data says. And so we make those recommendations, and then we face a little bit of heat. Alan, you've been dealing with that in your career?
Yeah, like you said, research is a big thing we rely on. going back to your comment there, you know, we get calls from people in western Nebraska versus eastern Nebraska, and they say people drive differently on one side of the state of Nebraska versus the other, and we as engineers try to be consistent with our decisions and our designs and things like that across the state of Nebraska and across the United States.
Sure.
And that's tough for some locals to understand why we're doing certain things.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons we're here today, because we're talking about speed limits, a thing that I have found to be counterintuitive to folks. Sometimes faster is safer, something people wouldn't necessarily tend to guess or believe. So start a little bit, first of all, with the authority. What authority do we have to set the speed limits? Is it our responsibility?
Yes, state statute gives the Department of Transportation the authority to set speed limits through communities for the state highway system. So we do that following.
So we handle it for our own system. We have the authority to set the speed limit.
Yes, statute does set some statutory speed limits, such as the interstate, county roads, you know, residential areas.
So there's maximums we can't go over,
Yes.
but we can always go lower, or is there's limits there too?
The statute also requires we do an engineering and traffic investigation. So
Well, that's
that's
good.
what Alan's section does.
They count on us. That's
They-
good for
They
the.
accounted for us.
Yeah, well, it's always nice to have in statute that we're going to rely on the engineering and the experts. That's great. We should have more of that. Okay, so we can set the speed limit on our own system, but if it's a city street, we, at the department, we don't have any authority there.
If it's off the highway system, no. Or if it's a community over 40,000 population, then the statute puts that authority onto those local
Onto
communities.
the locals, and then they do the same engineering studies we do.
Yes, they're required to do the same engineering
So what if a
study.
state highway goes through a small town, then who has the authority of the section that's through the small town?
We have the ultimate approval, but we work with the local community because they'll have to pass an ordinance, so it's a joint
So those two
effort
things have to line up.
that the analysis section works with the community.
And that's always a simple exercise, right, Alan?
Right, yeah. The biggest thing is these residents are living there. Their local sheriff has to enforce these speed limits also. So we want some sort of written ordinance saying that they concur with the findings and things like that. And that is probably one of the most difficult things that we have to encounter, just some of the paperwork, because communities all have different forms of government, and sometimes it takes weeks to pass.
Sure, and they change over. So
Yes.
you get a new
Oh, yeah.
commission, and they want a different speed limit, and now we got to go
Right.
have that conversation again, which is
Yep.
that's what we do.
We'll have a new mayor every 4 years
Yeah.
in a little town, and they want something different.
And so we don't just shut them down; we study it again usually.
Right, yeah.
A lot of history here. So the statute says we have to do a study. So what does this engineering study look like?
Our office, the analysis section, handles pretty much all the studies across the statewide. And a big thing is getting data. Over the last couple of years, especially, we've been asked to do a lot of speed studies. And so we've relied on our district help, especially out in the North Platte office, to gain data for us on site. We've reached out to the consultant community, and they've assisted with a lot of data collection across the state.
So what
also.
does a speed study look at? What are we doing?
So when we go on site, the biggest thing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, is speed data. Going out there with our radars or equipment and clocking free flow vehicles that are on the roadway. We try to do ideal conditions. We're not out there during snowstorms, or we try to find locations that are suitable also for our safety of our data collectors that aren't on hills or curves or things like that. We go out there and do a lot of on-site speed data collection.
So we're out there, we're just clocking vehicles, seeing
Yep.
how fast they're traveling.
And it varies if we're out in the middle of the country or if we're in a town. We'll collect pedestrian and traffic volumes also. We'll look for bicycles, like Dan mentioned earlier, traffic signals, things like that. It's a little different, and that's where the experience comes in to see what we need for these studies. We'll also look at the plans back in the office of the highway. What's the horizontal and vertical geometry of the roadway? What was it designed for? We'll look at sight distance for driveways and things like that. And we rely on our district a lot of time to help when they permit drives to make
And
sure.
So ultimately, though, a lot of the ways that we set speed limits comes down to what we call the 85th percentile. Dan, what is that, and why do we rely on that?
It's one way of looking at it is it's a survey of the local drivers driving through the community. So the 85th percentile is that speed that which 85% of the traffic is traveling at or slower. All 50 states kind of use that 85th percentile in establishing speed limits. When you establish the speed limit at that 85th percentile or within that area, it's considered the safest and most efficient method of setting the speed limit.
And so the idea is if most of the people are traveling around 60 miles an hour, then we want to set the speed limit at 60 miles an hour. Even if some might think that's too slow or too fast, but we're just looking at how fast people are traveling. And is it because we don't want to write tickets, Dan? What makes that safer?
One way of looking at it is drivers' behavior is an extension of society. They're going to drive at a speed they feel comfortable and safe at. Drivers aren't out there to drive excessively fast or in unsafe conditions. So this is a survey of those drivers. That's where that 85th percentile comes in. Drivers feel comfortable at this speed, so it's reasonable to make your speed limits a reflection of what drivers feel comfortable with.
And not just reasonable, but we hope it's safest, right? Because if people are driving that speed that they feel comfortable, most folks are going to be driving that way. And whether the speed limit is 45 or 65, if I feel comfortable driving 60, I'm probably going to drive 60. And then if you do set the speed limit much lower than that, then some people who will be very aware of the speed limit and attentive to it would be driving at that lower speed, and now you get a disparity between speeds, and that's when we get concerned, right, Dan?
Exactly, yeah. Ideally, we want to keep as much traffic flowing in that same pace of speed near that 85th percentile, so everyone's flowing the same speed. Like you said, if you have disparities where you have traffic going excessively slower or excessively faster, then you create this weaving and slowing and
well, as you say,
higher
we've all have probably experienced that, where you're driving on the interstate or on a road and you feel you're driving the speed limit or close, and you come up on somebody who's driving much slower, and by the time you realize it, you have to swerve or slam on your brakes, and you think, what? That person is dangerous.
Yeah. No,
and that's what we're trying to avoid.
When I was working out in Grand Island, I would travel back and forth between Grand Island and Lincoln all the time, and the one time I came across a camper probably going 35, 40 miles per hour, halfway on the shoulder, halfway on the lane, and everybody's honking at them, and it does create this unsafe environment when you get those big disparities.
Yeah, and so if you set the speed limit too low, you'd be creating that.
Oh yeah.
And we certainly want to avoid that.
And also, if you set the speed limit too low, you are making violators of the majority of the drivers that feel that they can drive it faster as a safe and reasonable speed.
Making us all criminals, right, Dan?
Another way of looking at it.
Yeah, and the local officials who have to enforce this, then they get all the calls of, why do you have the speed trap out there in the middle of nowhere when there's nothing out there to slow me down? We want to make us as engineers look good, and the local law enforcement's not the bad guys when we don't need to slow people down.
Yeah, I just think it's so interesting that if you lower the speed limit below what it should be set at, below that 85th percentile, you're actually making the road less safe. That's what the research shows us and tells us, and that's so counterintuitive, I think. Many people would think, well, just lower the speed limit and then we'll slow everybody down and it'll be a safer environment for everybody, but the research is the opposite.
Correct.
So we do get a lot of requests from communities who maybe want lower speed limits coming into their town on our highways, and we're looking at the free flow speed, that 85th percentile, but there probably are things we could do to slow people down, and it has nothing to do with the speed limit. What would some of those things be?
Enforcement, a big presence of enforcement can be an effective method of slowing traffic down. Other things you can do, traffic calming, geometric changes to your roadway.
Right, so to actually change the way the roadway feels and looks so that I don't feel as safe driving at a faster speed.
Right.
So what would some examples of that be?
Narrower lane limits would be one. It's kind of difficult for the highway system to do some traffic calming.
But in theory, instead of having a nice wide shoulder and a nice wide lane, if you come into town, you could drop the shoulder, narrow the lane, and some people might say, well, now you're making that a less safe roadway. But if you're trying to slow people down, that's how you could do it, and maybe you would have a safer roadway.
Right.
We've had some success where communities have put in these speed display signs. It can slow traffic down a little bit.
That's the one that says your speed as you get close to it?
Some people suspect over time that it may not be as effective, but we've had some success.
Okay, so it might work
spot
spot locations around schools or something like that at certain times. Have we done any of the traffic calming where we've maybe narrowed a lane, or that goes against our standards? So
we have not done a lot with our current standards.
Do you think
for
we
highway
should?
design. Well, that's something we can look into.
I'd say, like,
what do you think,
we
Alan?
have examples where we've maybe added a median in the center lane, but it's always a balancing act with oversized vehicles and semis and things. We're working on a project right now that has a traffic calming device that's been out there for a long time, but then we get the complaints when they're transporting
and they hit it.
turbine blades and things like that, through there, that they're hitting them. I mean, we have some, but like Dan said, we don't have a lot of.
We do have roundabouts.
Yes.
And that is a traffic
We start doing
calming
more
device.
of those, yeah. And how do communities feel when we propose roundabouts, Dan?
It's a mix.
It's a mix.
Some are for it, and some have not been so much for it. It's new, it's a change they're not used to, but overall, safety-wise, they are a proven safety
like the results,
improvement.
Yeah. And generally, communities come around, right, once we put them in.
Generally, yes.
Not always.
It just depends on where you're at in the state, and if we have other ones that we can show the communities that have worked. We have one just outside of Lincoln that has done wonders for slowing people down and reducing the amount of crashes out there, and especially the amount of severe crashes.
But it's another example of the work that you do being controversial or counterintuitive. Folks maybe don't want to hear about a roundabout. They want that traffic signal they're used to seeing, where our engineering data says a roundabout would be the best solution, and now we have to go convince a community of wannabe traffic engineers that that's the case.
Yes.
Everyone's a traffic engineer just like everyone wants to be a lawyer, I guess. You guys are like the lawyers of the engineering profession. Thank you guys for coming today. I've really enjoyed learning a little bit about traffic engineering from you. Thanks for all you do. I know you're dedicated to the field, but also understand the balance between the engineering and the community needs and sometimes the politics of those things, and being able to navigate that. It's a very interesting job that you have. So thanks for all you do and for taking some time today.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's my conversation with Dan and Alan. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If I have one takeaway, I think for me it's the fact that there's a lot of science that goes into setting speed limits, but there's a little bit of engagement as well. As the highways go in and out of communities, we've got to work with those folks to make sure that it meets their expectations. So that balance of data and engagement of the community is sort of a microcosm for a lot of things that we do. So I hope you enjoyed the podcast this week, and thanks to Dan and Alan for joining us. Until next time.